as part of my own personal battle of getting bombarded with noise from the airplanes refusing to follow the path they're supposed to fly on. And then that was 4 years ago. And then 2 years ago, I found out they were burning leaded fuel. And I said, this has got to stop. And so I just did a quick look on the internet, and I found that Chavez in Santa Clara County had led the fight and got leaded fuel banned at Reid-Hillview Airport. And now Cindy is part of the national effort to ban this dangerous pollutant, which is, looking at the statistics and the blood levels in children, this is just as serious as the Flint, Michigan water escapade. And so, as part of our effort to make this a safer community around here, we've been reaching out to government over and over, and we're hitting a brick wall. And I could see that Santa Clara County broke through, and that's what Sup Chavez and Prof. Lanphear are here tonight to kind of let us know how you did it, and hopefully give the technique and the courage to our elected officials here, both in the city and the county, because the airport's in the city, but it mainly flies over the county. And I also want to mention that my colleague Laura Kaplan here, she helped us organize along with a big team, and we've been collecting signatures to get it closing the airport on the ballot. And so we're just finding out whether we made it or not. And so that's going to be coming out in the next couple of days. So that's where we are right now. And that's what I want to get through tonight, is just how dangerous leaded aviation fuel is and what governments can do about it. So I just wanted that. So I guess we did have a little outline from Laura. So I want to hand it over to you, Supervisor Chavez, to kind of maybe give us a quick review on how you guys did it, what the battles were, and how you ended up here.
So if you don't mind, and so first of all, let me just say thank you, Laura. We're so excited to be here. Matt Wilson is on my team and is going to help us do some slides, if that's okay. And I'm really excited to have Dr. Lanphear here. He was just invaluable in helping us talk to the community locally in Santa Clara County. So I'm looking forward to hearing from him. And I'm gonna, if you don't mind, Dr. Lanphear, what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll through this, but I may just tap you on a couple of areas just to talk about the results of the study. I'll talk about how we got there. Is that okay? Okay, excellent. So Matt, do you mind if we do some slides? Can you do that? Okay, great. And colleagues, part of the reason I'm doing this is just it was easier for me to understand if I'm seeing pictures instead of having just someone yap at me. So we'll let this, perfect. And can you see it okay, everyone? Okay,
we can see it very well. And I also want to just point out to folks that HEP has put bios for both Supervisor Chavez and Professor Lanphear into the Q&A. So if you, I think, is it in the Q&A or in the chat? It's in the chat.
I put them in the chat. I put them in the chat. So
it's in the chat for folks if you want to see the bios of our speakers tonight. And I'm going to go ahead and go off camera. And
me too, just to make it easier for people to see. All right. So I'm so excited to be here, and I'm just going to give you a quick history of the area that I represent, because it might make this more clear about how we got into this. So I am a member of the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors. In Santa Clara County, we are 2 million people, so I represent about 400,000 people, and my district includes the east side of San Jose and the downtown, and the east side is primarily the poorest area in the community, and it's very, very ethnically diverse. Today, the east side is home to a large numbers of Latino and Asian immigrants and folks from all over, and many speak an English, a language other than English at home. It's also the location of Reid-Hillview Airport, and it's a general aviation airport similar to Boulder's, that the county of Santa Clara owns and operates. So I'm going to give you a quick history of Reid-Hillview. It's been in existence since before World War II and has been owned by the county here since 1961. It encompasses almost 200 acres and is surrounded by single-family homes, schools, childcare facilities, parks. It immediately adjacent to part of its runway are businesses, a shopping mall, parks, a major water park, highways, and public transportation hubs. And for decades, the community has been complaining about noise, pollution, and fear of plane crashes in our community. The most recent quest, and let me just say, people wanted to close the airport at different times, and it's been an ongoing struggle, especially as the community built up closer and closer around it. But the most recent effort to close the airport and the work taken to ban leaded fuel really began in earnest in 2018. At that time, myself and my colleagues on the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors took 11 actions to plan for the site if the airport were to close. A critical action was for us to decline FAA funding so we could potentially close the airport as early as 2031. We also called for a preliminary community outreach to hear from residents what they wanted to see if the airport ever did close. The other action was to order a study to determine whether or not airborne lead emissions from Reid-Hillview Airport resulted in elevated blood lead levels for children who live in and around the airport. And this really played a critical role, people understanding the impact of lead. The 2018 actions came literally after decades and decades of community consternation about the airport's continuing presence. So in 2021, the Board of Supervisors commissioned a scientific study to determine if the leaded aviation fuel used by the vast majority of the planes at Reid-Hillview Airport was impacting the health of our residents. And I'm sure everyone here is well aware that there is no safe level of lead in our blood, in human blood, especially in children whose bodies and brains are still developing. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention put it succinctly: even low levels of lead in blood have been shown to affect IQ, ability to pay attention, and academic achievement. Now, we chose to focus on children, not only because there are 21 schools alone within the 1.5 radius of the airport, but also we have a lot of information about blood lead levels because we test children in California. The study was led by Dr. Sammy Zaran from Colorado State University, and he published a number of studies on lead exposure through various pathways, including 19 studies on environmental lead exposure, including examining Flint, Michigan's water supply a decade ago. Our study involved a comprehensive and controlled review of 10 years of data of lead levels for over 13,000 children. It was peer reviewed by none other than Dr. Lanphear was one of those peer reviewers, so he can talk more about that. And it controlled for non-aviation lead, such as old pipes, paint, and other factors. What it found was that children living downwind of the airport had a higher blood lead level with increases of 0.40 micrograms per deciliter over children living upwind from the airport. And for context, the lead levels detected during the peak of the Flint, Michigan water crisis were between 0.35 and 0.45 micrograms per deciliter. Now, when this was released, the study was released, it really unleashed concerns from all over our community, not just those directly impacted, but others in our community as well. What that led to was the Board of Supervisors directing county staff to find ways to reduce leaded gas emissions at the airport. And I will just, let me just say this, especially for those of you who you can see this, and we'll make the slides available to all of you. But I do want to just make this point that the board, the reason we looked at lead levels is that the EPA had done a study previously that demonstrated that there was a significant amount of lead, for communities living around airports. But a number of people in our community said that can't be true. And so if there's lead in our community, it's because of other factors. And that ultimately was why we did the study. But more importantly, once the study came to fruition, everybody on the board, irrespective of how they feel about closing the airport, Reid-Hillview specifically, agreed that we should not sell any leaded aviation gas at our airports. And that action actually came from another colleague who was so disturbed by what he read that he said we shouldn't do it for any airport, which is why we became the first airports in the country not to sell leaded fuel, was really from the unanimity of the board. And I think what's important to understand about that is the scientific research and work done by Dr. Zaran and the peer-reviewed study really helped people understand that the risks were real. So that led directly to what I just said about us being the first, but it also meant that the unleaded fuel that we make available at Reid-Hillview today and at San Martin, which is the other airport that we own and operate, is 94 octane and is FAA certified as safe for use and for approximately 68 of the piston powered aircraft of the type used at Reid-Hillview and San Martin. And moreover, just to be clear, we haven't banned leaded fuel. We will not sell it at our airports. But here's what we observed. Year over year, we're selling about the same amount of fuel now year over year, which means that a super majority of the aircraft can actually use it, or we would have seen a drop in the purchase of fuel. I think most of us would agree that transitioning away from leaded fuel is the right thing to do, but it's not entirely easy and it's not entirely a clear process. And we got a lot of pushback and resistance from pilots and the fuel industry. And there are a number of FAA regulations that have to be followed when you make this kind of transition. And there are financial, staffing, and equipment training considerations that come with fuel switches at the airport. In the case of Santa Clara County, we own and operate the airport. So we had to look at every single lease and every single contract to make sure we had the power to be able to sell that unleaded avgas at our airports. Our journey to eliminating avgas sales from our two airports was complex. And I will tell you, we didn't follow a point-by-point script because there wasn't one. And I will tell you that all of your airports are structured, and in Boulder, they're probably structured slightly differently. But what we did do is we got the most willing, bright people we could, our county staff, our in-house attorneys, outside organizations that offered insight. And our actions in 2021 and 2022, as you probably know, drew attention from communities like yours from all over the country. As you may know, the EPA in October of 2023 issued an endangerment finding that emissions of leaded aviation gasoline from piston engine aircraft engines is a public health hazard. And this finding is an important step toward desperately needed changes to regulate the industry, especially the avgas industry. Santa Clara County, along with environmental groups, including Earth Justice, had a nationwide coalition of community groups really worked tirelessly to push the EPA to issue the endangerment finding. And we're only months away from a presidential election, as you know. So it's critical that we get this information out as quickly as possible. The EPA did not issue an endangerment finding on regarding leaded aviation fuel during either the Obama or Clinton administrations, let alone any Republican administration in the last 50 years. And I hope all of you in Colorado who care about banning leaded fuel and protecting children's health, and frankly, all of our health, are thinking about that, not only as we get into the elections, but as we think about the leaders of our local governments as well. So if you don't mind, I do want to just ask Dr. Lanphear if he could give just a little more perspective as we wrap up on the importance of the action that was taken and how that might impact all of you. And so, Matt, if you could remove that screen, then I'd love to turn it over to Dr. Lanphear. You're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And what I'd like to do is provide a little background just very quickly on the study to show what the impact is from these aircraft emissions. and then talk a little bit about what we know about low-level lead poisoning and why this is so important. So first, the study. What I want to show you here is what happens as the amount of air traffic increases. And first, the first line you'll see is the predicted blood lead levels of children who live within a half a mile of the airport. And as traffic increases, so does their blood lead level. In contrast, for those kids who live further away, the increase is less steep. It's not zero, but it's less steep. And this is almost, you can almost think about this like a randomized controlled trial, like a drug trial. What this basically says is, this is showing us that for children who live near the airport, their blood levels are increasing exactly as we would predict. Further away, we don't see it. And that speaks to this being a critical exposure for these children. The other way I want to frame this is to look at what happens as you increase the number of risk factors for children. And I'm going to put it in context of the current definition of what you might call an elevated blood level, or you could call it lead poisoning, low-level lead poisoning. And that is having a blood lead level in excess of 3.5 microgram per deciliter. That's the CDC's definition of an unacceptably high level. 3.5 microgram per deciliter, that's equivalent to 35 parts per billion of lead circulating in children's blood. Now, 1 part per billion is equivalent to 1 tablespoon of sugar in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So it's a very small amount, but it's quite consequential. Lead is a strong neurotoxicant, and as I show you, it does other things as well. So if we look at a typical toddler, 1 or 2 year old child living in this area, their blood lead level was about 1.8 microgram per deciliter. For kids who lived near to the airport, it increased to 2.5. Those with during maximum traffic living near the airport to 3.3. If they lived east or downwind, it increased to 3.5. And then if they were lower SES, 3.7. But I really like to focus more on the percent of kids who were lead poisoned based upon the CDC's definition. And you can see it goes from 5.7 to 7 to 10.5, and almost 14% of kids exceed that level. And this is from the airport emissions. Another way to look at this is the EPA scientists have published this study showing that beginning at the lowest measurable level, as the amount of lead in air increases, children's blood lead levels increases quite sharply, beginning at the lowest measurable levels. That's really important. There's not a line where you don't see any increase in blood lead and then it increases. It increases beginning at the lowest measurable levels. For young children, they're going to be exposed through inhalation and through ingestion. Air lead will settle out in their homes and they'll pick it up through normal mouthing behaviors or through eating their food. And toddlers will absorb lead more readily than older children and adults. 70% of airborne lead in the United States is from leaded aviation fuel, 70%. That's today. Of course, 50 years ago, it was mostly from automobiles, but today, 70% of airborne lead is from leaded aviation fuel. And 16 million Americans live within 1 kilometer of one of these general airports. About 3 million of those are children. This is showing that the lead in paints, that's what the one on the right, tend to be much larger than the lead particles in aircraft exhaust. And that's important for a couple reasons. The finer or the smaller the particles are, the more readily they can get into the lungs, the more readily they can get into the blood system. And we also know that metals like lead can go directly up the olfactory nerve. There are metal transporters in the olfactory nerve directly into the brain. So the smaller size of these lead particles from aircraft exhaust make these more hazardous than larger particles. We finished a study just last year that showed extraordinarily small increases in the amount of lead. Lead that increases that most people think of as innocuous or safe. A small increase of 10 part per billion of lead in the blood of pregnant women led to a 50% increase in premature birth. 50% increase in premature birth. We also found that for women who were low in vitamin D, it's about 15% of women in our cohort, and that's probably a low estimate from many communities in America. A 10 part per billion increase in pregnant women with low vitamin D levels was associated with almost a threefold increase in premature birth, which is huge. We also know, and this is something that most of you are familiar with, as blood lead levels increase, beginning at the lowest measurable levels, we see a steep drop off in children's reading abilities. And we see the same thing with children's intellectual abilities. Again, very steep at the lowest levels. And let me just show you what that looks like when you look at a bell curve, the distribution of kids.
Most of us have IQ scores that fall somewhere between 85 and 115 points. Only 2.5% of children have an IQ above 130, which is considered gifted. There are about 6 million children in this group. On the other end of the curve, another 2.5% of children have an IQ below 70, which is considered challenged. The impact of exposure to a toxin like lead causes a 5-point drop in IQ across a population. This shift results in a 57% increase in the number of children who are challenged, from 6 million to 9.4 million. There is a corresponding decrease in the number of children that are gifted, from 6 million to 2.4 million. Little shifts matter. The impact of exposure to another toxin, like flame retardants, results in a further increase in the number of children who are challenged, from 9.4 million to over 11 million. There is a further decrease in the number of gifted children.
So that represents what happens when you see a 5-point drop in IQ in a population of kids. Could be from lead, it could be from anything. You may not see it quite this large in a community around the airport, but the same principle holds, that you're shifting the curve, increasing the number of children who will be challenged and diminishing the number of children who are gifted. So what all of these studies suggest, that there really is no safe level that can be identified for lead. We've seen blood lead levels and lead poisoning rates come down over the past 50 years, but our blood lead levels today, yours, mine, our children, are still 10 to 100 times more higher than our pre-industrial ancestors. So they're still quite high on an evolutionary scale. This is showing another national study in the United States where we saw an increase in blood lead level from the lowest third to the highest third was associated with a doubling of ADHD in children. We found that 600,000, about 1 of every 5 cases of ADHD, could be attributed back to lead exposure in the United States. There's been a lot more attention focused on lead as a risk factor for chronic heart disease, coronary heart disease in particular, and heart attacks. So these are a variety of risk factors, but what we've learned over the past 10 years is that lead is one of the most important risk factors for heart attacks. And this is a meta-analysis basically showing whether you're talking about cardiovascular disease more broadly, that includes heart attacks and strokes, whether you're talking about coronary heart disease or heart attacks specifically, or whether you're talking about strokes. Lead is a risk factor for all of those. And the evidence would suggest that what's happening is that lead creates tears on the inside of the arterial lining, which then allows for lipids and cholesterol and other gradu to get in there, and that ultimately forms a plaque. And then when that plaque ruptures, that's when you have a heart attack. So let me just show you another quick slide of what we found in terms of the impact of lead exposure on heart attacks in the United States.
Lead is a risk factor for coronary heart disease. That's when your heart is slowly or suddenly suffocated by an obstruction of the arteries feeding the heart. In a national study, we found that deaths increased sharply at blood lead levels below 50 parts per billion, the level considered safe. There was no threshold or safe level. If we let the narrowing of this coronary artery represent the risk of dying from heart disease, you can see that most of the narrowing occurs below 50 parts per billion. We found that lead accounts for about 185,000 deaths every year. That makes lead the leading cause of fatal heart attacks in the United States.
So these are some steps that we can take today to protect children and the rest of us from lead poisoning. First, to set a national goal: no child with a blood lead level greater than 1 microgram per deciliter, which is equivalent to 10 parts per billion by 2030. Now that's ambitious, but it's doable. We know what the major sources of lead are. We need to expand the national air lead monitoring network, including having networks around airports. Right now, because we don't have those monitors, we're relying on using children as biological indicators of lead emissions from these airports. We need to continue to mitigate lead hazards in houses and soils, use certified filters to reduce lead until lead service lines are replaced, continuing to reduce allowable levels of lead in food. You'll all have heard occasional reports of lead in baby food, for example. To eliminate lead in aviation fuel by 2025 or earlier. Again, it's aspirational, but it's doable. And finally, until then, you may want to consider using HEPA air cleaners in your home, like an air purifier, more wet mopping, and HEPA vacuuming. It may reduce exposure. That's not been proven, but those are steps that you may want to consider. And I'll stop there. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Lanphear. That's pretty devastating, the just kind of the facts of these peer-reviewed studies. And I was, like I mentioned, Robert Boutel's study that he gave something very similar in February to the city of Westminster, which is dealing with the airport RMMA. So yeah, it's a widespread issue around here. As Laura mentioned, we've got 3 other airports nearby, and every single aviation group there is downplaying the effects of lead, and some do kind of serious degrees, but that's kind of what we're up against, and I'm hoping that we can talk about maybe how you were able to fight back against because I know the FAA came at you and said, yeah, we're going to have to stop this. We need a response. But let me hand this over to Laura. She had a bunch of nice questions lined up. And I did want to say, when I was out gathering signatures, I was at the Whole Foods. And this guy from Denmark showed up. I won't try to reproduce his accent, but he's like, we don't have this problem over in Denmark because the airplanes don't burn leaded fuel. They all have mufflers and they're not allowed to fly low over people's houses. So we've reduced our blood lead exposure, but also the noise exposure. And yeah, all of Europe is like that with the Swiss made and the German made mufflers, and then the unleaded fuel. But Laura, can you
Yes. Hep, thank you so much. And thank you, Supervisor Chavez and Dr. Lanphear, for those presentations. Educational, horrifying in some respects, but very uplifting to hear about what you have been able to do in Santa Clara County to reduce the impacts to your folks who live around those airports and blaze a trail for others who might be interested. We do have some questions that were submitted ahead of the webinar. I also want to take this opportunity to invite everybody who is participating in the webinar tonight to submit your questions via the Q&A function. We thought that that would be the most organized way to bring other people's questions in. So I'm going to go ahead and take questions through the Q&A. I'll read out people's questions. And then also, like I said, we have a queue of questions that were developed before ahead of time. So I'll start with the questions that are already in the Q&A. So we have one here for kids or big people that are adversely affected by elevated blood lead levels. Are there any ways to help remove the existing lead from the body safely? I think that would be for you, Dr. Lanphear.
There's some evidence, but it's not as reassuring as we'd like. For children, there are chelation drugs that can be used when the kids have very high blood lead levels, and they will keep children from dying. That's not the kind of exposures, thankfully, we're having around airports. At lower levels, chelation doesn't appear to benefit kids. It doesn't reverse damage that appears to have happened. There's some evidence for adults who have chronic kidney disease, which is also a consequence of one of the consequences of lead exposure, that you can slow the progression to chronic renal failure. And there's some evidence in a new study that will come out soon that you can also reduce heart attacks in people who've already had a heart attack. That's, again, perhaps not as great as we hope in terms of the reduction, but all of it still clearly, for me, points to the fact that we need to reduce exposure in the first place rather than rely on chelation, except in those cases where we failed to protect kids and the rest of us.
Thank you, Dr. Lanphear. And I do think I saw somebody suggesting that perhaps donating blood can help lower blood levels in the body. Is that something that is recommended in any way? One does worry about the people who might receive that blood, but is that anything that you have heard about?
I haven't seen studies that have actually tested that. In theory, yes, it should. We've done that study to look at forever chemicals, PFAS chemicals, and show that you can reduce your exposures quite a bit in firefighters in an Australian study. It would make sense, and it may in fact be part of the reason, this is speculation, but part of the reason that women have lower rates of coronary heart disease is up until about menarche, puberty, boys and girls have blood lead levels that are comparable. Around puberty, it starts to drop off by about 20%, and it stays lower until menopause, at which point it spikes up again, and so does coronary heart disease rate. So coronary heart disease in menopausal and postmenopausal women are comparable with men, but throughout the reproductive period, it's lower. It might be part of the reason it's lower.
Very interesting. We have one more question about health impacts here. Wondering, it sounds like the primary pathways that lead gets into the body are through inhalation, or you mentioned also, like for kids especially, like it can be taken up by the hands, and then they eat. When they eat with their hands, they but not so much absorption through the skin. But we do have a question about if you buy food that is from a garden that might be under the pathway of airplanes, is that lead dust being uptaken by the plants so that when you eat the food, you eat plants with a bunch of lead?
If you have lead settle out from airborne lead onto the plants itself, like on leafy vegetables, you may very well get some of that. Trying to quantify that and say how much is probably a little challenging. I don't know that I could come up with a specific amount, but you're going to get some. And if it settles into the soil, some plants and vegetables will take some of that up. Things like mustard seed, for example, seem to preferentially take up lead and concentrate it. And sometimes that's being used to try to remediate contaminated soils. So it can get taken up. It probably is going to be more for air emissions, is going to be some degree of inhalation, and again, especially for kids, ingestion.
Thank you. We have a question here. This one's probably more for Supervisor Chavez. What was the FAA's response to the banning of lead fuel at Reid-Hillview?
So they were unhappy. I mean, that might be a little bit of an understatement. And what happened was that there were two kind of responses. One was from the FAA directly, and they were unhappy and they were concerned. And then they said, well, look, maybe we can work with you to better understand how to make this transition. And so they offered to do a demonstration project with us so that we could use the evidence, presumably from what we were experiencing, to help them understand how to help airports across the country transition. What happened is that we were working on an MOU to discuss this with them. And over the last year, they've gone a little bit quiet on the demonstration project. In the meantime, there were complaints filed by the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, the General Aviation Manufacturing Association, the National Air Transportation Association, and the National Business Aviation Association for a Part 13 investigation and complaint. And so, and the FAA, and I'm reading these notes because I want to make sure I get this right. The FAA initiated an informal investigation in December of 2021, and then suspended it in February of 22, pursuant to an MOU between the county and the FAA. And as part of the MOU, the county agreed to consider participation in this demonstration project, but we haven't, the FAA has not come back and said, here are the parameters of that project. And that was something similar with the Part 16 investigations that were raised by, a subset of the other industry organizations. So, we are in communication with the FAA, but I would say they're not robustly moving on the demonstration project at this time. So we're a little bit in limbo, but they weren't happy.
So if I could try to summarize, when you say they're not happy, what kind of communication were you getting from them? Let me ask that question before I try to summarize.
Well, and maybe I can be more helpful. They raised concerns about access for pilots of fuel, both leaded, really leaded fuel at the airports. And then concurrent to that, these complaints were filed, which then forced them into this investigation track. Both those investigations were halted as they were considering doing a demonstration project with us on how airports could transition from leaded avgas to unleaded avgas. And that's where it stands today. And the reason how displeasure was shared was very direct, that there was a high level of interest in us being collaborative, and we had been speaking out with the EPA, and a number of Congress members, including Congressmember Ro Khanna, pulled a hearing together at the federal level so that we could explain the problem in the middle of all of this activity, and the FAA did not attend the hearing.
Thank you for that. So would it be accurate to say no lawsuit has been filed against you? You haven't been sued in court?
That's correct.
And the FAA has not levied any fines against you for violating your grant agreements?
That's correct.
They did express displeasure. There were Part 16 complaints filed by outside, and Part 13 filed by outside parties, which is a complaint with the FAA, basically saying that you have done something wrong and they want the FAA to investigate, but the FAA suspended those investigations and they basically haven't pursued any penalties, or have there been any other consequences that you have suffered as a result of stopping selling leaded fuel?
We are in communication with the FAA over any number of concerns that they have about the condition of the airports and other issues that they've raised. And And I will just stop there to say, I think that we have their attention, which is why they wanted to do a demonstration project. It's unclear to me why that's been halted, and it's unclear to me what the status of the investigations are at this time.
Okay, thank you so much, Supervisor.
No, and thanks for saying it back to me. That was helpful.
No worries. I know that there are some folks here who have a very broad base of knowledge about how the FAA works and what is a Part 16 complaint and what is a Part 13 complaint and whether that's litigation or not. So just wanted to make sure that everybody here has an understanding that you haven't been sued, you haven't been fined, it sounds like the FAA is trying to be collaborative and figure out a path forward, using you as a demonstration project, but that has sort of been put on hold and you haven't heard much about it.
Well, and I would say that for a time they were trying to be collaborative, and it's unclear to me what they're thinking right now.
Okay.
We've had a long relationship with the FAA because we've had an airport for a long time. So I'm kind of dissecting one component of that partnership.
Yes. And I think a lot of people are surprised that it's not always clear cut and it's not always fast when you're working with a federal agency, and they may send you a communication and things may evolve and change, and it's not always clear exactly where things stand. So thank you for helping us clarify the mud. So I'm looking at our questions here. One of the questions that we got was if you have recommendations for communities that might be considering pursuing a similar action in terms of stopping selling leaded aviation fuel. Like, let's say, for example, that a city council from an unnamed city that might or might not be paying attention to this webinar might want to follow in your footsteps and stop selling leaded aviation fuel. Would you have any advice for that jurisdiction? In particular with regard to any considerations around legal liability or the things that you thought about before you did it?
The first thing I would say is that every action that we took at the board, we rallied hundreds of people to come out and speak. And there's nothing like that gets around good old-fashioned organizing. And that's really important to understand, because the base of people who are engaged in this issue has to be broad and energetic. And these are long fights, right? These are the horizons long. So one, I would say, is organizing. And the second thing is that, one of the challenges with legal counsel is that their job is to make sure that they protect the institution, the fiduciary the responsibility of the institution is of high value, and that you don't break any rules. But when you're trying to change rules, what you need are leadership from your staff and your attorneys that help you understand how to move from path A to point B, point A to point B. And so we engaged our really savvy staff, our county counsel's office, and we hired outside counsel of Kaplan and Kirsch. And there might be a third partner there, but we hired outside counsel. Now, what I will say is, in order to get your staff to move in a particular direction, you have to have a majority of your board. And the only way to get a majority of your board is through really thoughtful organizing and helping them, all of your council or your board, understand the implications of the problem in front of you. Now, Reid-Hillview is a little unique in that we have two airports, as I said. In San Martin Airport, we're not pursuing closure for that airport. That airport, in the same 1.5 mile radius, we have 50,000 people that live within 1.5 miles of Reid-Hillview. The other airport has about 13,000 people. And so we're pursuing the closure of one airport. So we're selling only unleaded fuel at both airports. And we're pursuing closure of Reid-Hillview in 2031. That airport, that time horizon was set because we do not receive airport improvement grants. And anytime you take a grant from the federal government for the airport, it adds 20 years life to the airport, or did at the time we were taking these actions. We stopped accepting airport improvement grants in 2011. When I got on the board, we took a formal action to not accept them. And that gives us the flexibility to close the airport in 2031. But organizing what you're doing right now. Educate people, excite them, engage them, and then, have a game plan that helps people see where the end is in near. Or, I mean, what the end goal is and how close you can pull it to your current date.
Thank you so much. Let's bounce back to another couple of questions about the lead study. So I think one thing that people are curious about is, how did you get the children's blood lead samples? Is that something that California just does, and then anybody who's a researcher can have access to? Or was there any kind, what did you have to do to get access to those samples to be able to do the statistical study that you did?
So in California, if you live within certain zip codes, your pediatrician is required to sample blood for lead. And in this area, it's a very low income area. And so I imagine that most of the zip codes were included. It is not easy to get this information. And one of the things that took a while before we were able to move the study was we had to get a memorandum of understanding with the California Department of Public Health. We had to assure that we were going to anonymize the data, and a number of other agreements that we had to make to access that. And I think, and maybe Dr. Lanphear, you might have another a tip you want to throw in here, but for us, having access to that over an extended period of time really allowed for more validity in terms of the study. And what's more interesting, and I want to say this again, when we brought this issue to the board, we were using the EPA's study that was a national study, and it was actually the pilots who said, that is not true. You're wrong. And it was in response to the pilots saying that the study wasn't correct that we actually invested in the ultimate study that we did, which I think is really important to know, because even though they were asking the question, when the study came back and said, no, we do have a lead problem, they still didn't believe it. So I say that because the EPA has done some research that you might already be able to use. But Dr. Lanphear, I'd be curious if I misspoke or if there's anything you could add to that.
But the main thing I'd like to add, Cindy, is that not every city or county should need to do a study like that. We now have 3 studies. One that looked at, Sammy did across all of Michigan, another study in North Carolina, and now this study around Reid-Hillview, and even the study by the Colorado Department of Public Health. All of them showing the same pattern. Now, the Colorado Department of Public Health was not as nuanced as the Reid-Hillview Airport was, but they all confirm the same thing, that children who live around, and children are just sentinel chickens, right? All of us are exposed, but children, because they're being blood tested regularly, were able to be used as monitors because we're not using air monitors and because it's done regularly. We should not have to do studies around every airport to prove to the pilots or the naysayers. The evidence is clear and compelling from the existing studies, from the EPA's own work. We know enough. We don't need to do studies around every airport. There's nothing wrong with it, but if it's being used as a delay tactic, if people are refuting the evidence, we don't need to do it.
Thank you, Doctor. And Matt Wilson, I see that you came onto camera. Was there something that you wanted to add in support, or?
Actually, it was the opposite. I was sneezing and turned off my camera.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, no worries. And thank you, Dr. Lanphear, for bringing up that, when these studies come out, there is often opposition or people saying the study wasn't adequate. We did actually have a study in our area where lead was looked at in concentration in soil samples and in air samples. And it's being touted as proof that we do not have a lead problem. And I don't know if you are familiar with those studies that were done in our area, or if you have any thoughts about whether looking at soil samples and air concentrations is an adequate way to gauge whether we have a lead problem.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with those specific studies. I'm familiar with other studies like that done around Reid-Hillview and other places. The problem with those is they're looking at typically short-term measurements of exposure. When we looked at children over this 8-year period in Reid-Hillview, what we're looking at is chronic exposures. And so if I went and stood half a mile away from the airport for 1 hour or 1 day or 3 days, and then you tested my blood, you're not going to pick that up. If I went and lived there, and certainly if my granddaughter went and lived there for 6 months, a year, you're absolutely going to pick it up on a population level. And so one of the problems with those is they're looking at short-term exposures, and those will often, or if not invariably, fail to detect a problem when one exists.
No, I just wanted to bring up my neighbor across the street. They've got a 4-year-old daughter, and they're redoing their house, so they're not living right there. But we live at the end of the runway, in a place in houses that were built 60 years before the airport was built. And I got to say, the naysayers about toxicity from lead have come out pretty heavy, especially in the popular literature where the CDOT study, and they were crowing about the Pinion Engineering soil sample results. But it's kind of like I told them I don't think they should move back because their daughter's 4. She's already lived there for 3 years. And, the planes come over at less than 500 feet over their house on takeoff. And these are mostly the tow pilots. So they're old, heavy airplanes that are, they're Pawnees crop dusters, and they're pulling a glider. And, I just think there's got to be some other mechanism here. It sounds like you guys are very organized, but, I'm just wondering, does it make sense for the city just to say, all right, we're going to do what's right and not worry about we're going to have to deal with the consequences, but shouldn't they just do what's right and protect the people that are out here in the county that are taking the main hammering from the noise and the leaded avgas? Isn't there a way for them to just stand up to the FAA and just take it? Did you have to do that a little bit?
So I just wanted to say how wise Dr. Lanphear is that we have been sharing our study across the country so people don't have to do an updated study. Now, one challenge we had is that the study from the EPA was a little older, and so that was part of what people were grousing about. But nonetheless, I just love your point, Bruce, about don't let people delay you. The pilots are here's the reality of it. The reality is we have to build enough community excitement so that you change the dynamic in the discussion. We had hundreds of people come out and say, I don't want lead in my family or my body or my family's body. And we got lots of emails from people who'd lived there years before who'd had miscarriages or other issues send me notes saying, could this have been the reason that this happened to me, or that I've had this health condition? And, not being a doctor, I didn't respond to it that way, but only to say that, that it does take a lot of energy to stand up and to push back. Now, one of the reasons this was so compelling to the county is counties across the country, we're in the business of protecting human health. We have public health departments. Some large cities do too, but we're in the public health business. That's our whole goal. We have hospitals. I don't want to, have the county do things that are so contradictory. And I think the board really understood that and really desired to take the next steps. But is it challenging? Yes, it's very challenging. And I was looking just at one of the questions in the chat. I thought this was an interesting one about how confident am I in the FAA Eagle Initiative, given that the co-chairs and the presidents of these organizations are the ones that are pursuing us in the Part 13 investigation. And the fact is that it is a politically charged environment. And if we lean in together, it is going to be easier to make the changes we want to see. But it requires us recruiting many, many people, educating many, many people, and helping people see a vision for how our communities can be healthier.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to another question that we have here But I think that, you know, what I'm hearing is if a community wants to make a change, you don't necessarily need to do another study. The evidence is there. The evidence is clear. The different studies all concur with each other. You're just going to find the same thing if you do another study, and a study can be used as a delay tactic. And that what it takes is for people to stand up and organize and call for change as a community and get the political will built. We had a question about airport closure. Is Reid-Hillview still on schedule to close? Has that decision been made, or it's just something that is an option that you have on the table as an option? But if you are going to close, can you say more about that? And then how does that impact your other airport, or what is the future of your other airport?
So we're only pursuing the closure of one airport, and that's Reid-Hillview. And we're not pursuing the closure of San Martin, in part because of the smaller number of people who live in and around the airport, but also because that part of our county is the business there is largely agricultural, and a lot of the people who live around that community want the airport because they use it to be able to travel from here to other places in the state to look at crops, not so much to move anything, but just to use it as transportation. The county has not accepted airport improvement grants since 2011, which gives the board the opportunity to close the airport in 2031. We're beginning a second phase of study on what are all the different land uses that the Reid-Hillview Airport can be used for. And we broke ground about a week ago on a light rail system that will come right past this property, which will allow for it to be developed into any number of things and be able to access this public transportation hub that we hope will be developed on the east side. And the investment of light rail and the investment in part comes because there's a strong belief that eventually this property will be redeveloped. And I hope stay in county ownership so that the uses there are uses that are good for the entire community.
Okay, so it sounds like there hasn't been one vision developed for what the future of that property is, but there is a sort of an expectation or a desire that it will eventually be redeveloped for community use.
And the planning is happening now. We just got funding for the planning, the second phase of planning in this budget cycle.
Great, thank you for that. So we have some questions in the chat from some of our folks who are very sophisticated and have some pretty detailed questions. So I'm going to go ahead and read some of them out, and you may or may not be the appropriate people to answer them, but let's give it a shot. So has anyone considered pursuing the avenue of toxic trespass for lead particles by property owners surrounding airports? Do you know anything about that? Toxic trespass for lead
No,
particles?
but I thought it was intriguing. You'll laugh. It's in my notes now. I'm going to have to go think about whether or not that's an opportunity or an option. So thank you.
Okay, we're planting some seeds here, potentially. Do you know when the EPA CASAC will make an announcement about whether they recommend lowering the NAAQS? And I don't know what any of those acronyms mean.
Yes. So this is the lead National Ambient Air Quality Standard, and that's the allowable levels of lead in the air. The EPA, I'm on this LeadNext panel. We've gone through the ISA and reviewed the evidence, the new evidence that's come out since the last time it was reviewed. My guess, and I can only guess, is that probably it will be sometime in 2025 that a decision will be made based upon the recommendation of the panel that ultimately goes to the EPA administrator, and the administrator makes the final decision.
Okay, so sometime in the next couple of years, there might be different ambient air quality standards for lead.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Do we know whether someone has responsibility to have soils tested annually near airports and make those results available publicly, especially if it might impact agricultural production or food?
I wouldn't know that nationally. I would be interested, Bruce, if you know of something specific. We don't, to my knowledge, there's nobody that I don't know whose job that is, if there is anybody's job. I will say the way we have handled that as a county is, and we have and I don't know, I think they're all over, but there are air quality districts. So our air quality districts put up, some ambient air testing around the airports. So there is that, but not soil to my knowledge. And so I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with soil requirements either. I know when I was on the lead NACS panel in 2006 to 2008, we recommended dramatically ramping up the number of air monitors around the country for measuring lead. That wasn't done. We have 3,000, I think, for PM 2.5 and 100, maybe closer to 200 for lead. And those could be used for two things. Primarily today, they're being used to monitor those areas where the EPA thinks there's a chance of exceeding the existing levels. From my perspective, it's as important, maybe more important, to use these monitors, and that's why we need to increase the number around the country to make sure that we're adequately protecting people from airborne lead. My estimate from the evidence out there today, we're not. But it's hard to know because we haven't had those monitors out there, and that's why we've had to rely on using children as monitors.
Which again seems very dystopian. that's the way that we know we have a problem, is because these children who don't get a second chance, they don't get a second childhood, have unacceptable levels of lead in their blood.
Well,
one thing that has come up a bunch when we talk about closing our airport is, if we closed the airport, would we have to do some kind of remediation for fuel spills or for just the impacts of airborne lead settling onto the airport soil? Is that something that you folks have considered or are thinking about in your planning? Have you done testing to see whether remediation might be necessary, and think about what that might cost?
I would love to have Bruce, can you talk just a little bit about lead accumulation in soil? Because I will share one thing we're learning, but I'd be curious about if you could talk, because it's come up in the chat a couple times, and Laura's question's a good one.
Yeah. So I haven't actually studied soil around airports particularly. I've studied soil around houses in several cities, and that can be a problem, both from fallout of leaded gasoline when it hits the walls in the past, and lead paint. Oftentimes we'll see levels like in Rochester, 1,000 parts per million, very high. In terms of if you have a concentrated amount, like you have a fuel tank with leaded aviation fuel, it's very likely, or even just fuel itself in a tank, oftentimes those will leak, and those will need to be sampled and probably cleaned up pretty extensively before any houses or other developments put in there.
So, and what I would add is that California has really strict rules about what you can develop with, so you have to test soil at different levels, even to make sure that you're being extremely careful about when you're able to build or not build. So I would say that we definitely have concern, and we'll make sure that we do all those soil studies. I do think that in certain parts of the airport, perhaps where you have, where you may have a mechanic shop and there's, seepage, that you could have a problem. If you have an underwater or high groundwater table, there's probably challenges with that too. One thing I will say is that for us, our fuel systems, our fuel tanks are above grade. And so we're less actually worried about that, because I think the point that Dr. Lanphear raised is that there's a higher level of risk when something is below grade, in part because you're not able to see it and stop it if it's leaking as easily as you can if it's above grade. So for Reid-Hillview, I'm concerned whenever we're redeveloping anything, but I'm not, I don't think we've done enough research yet for me to be able to know the answer to that question exactly, except to say that you know, we do have a lot of rules and we're going to be very careful before we develop on top of these properties, this property.
Good to know. Thank you so much. You know, for a community that might be considering steps like that, it's good to be able to follow in the footsteps of someone who has done it and considered it. So perhaps we'll follow along on your journey as you think more about, you know, does topsoil need to be scraped? Are certain areas of the airport more prone to contamination than others? And maybe there are some parts that you worry about and some parts that you don't. So, so thank you for that. We did have a question about, you know, if someone were trying to estimate how much lead, you know, like trying to do a visual, like this number of pounds of lead, which is, you know, equivalent to a pile this high. How would you estimate how much lead is being emitted annually? Is it something that can be based on fuel sales, based on number of operations? Has anybody tried to estimate how much lead is being emitted by Reid-Hillview Airport operations annually?
So when the EPA did their study, they were able to quantify what they thought the I don't know if they used pounds. I can't really remember that study off the top of my head. But we have not done a visual like it's a basketball size or anything like that. In fact, I think Bruce did a good job of explaining how much lead. And maybe Bruce, if you could say again what the spoon in the Olympic sized pool, just maybe describe that for a moment, because I think that really helps people understand how little it takes to negatively impact human health.
Yeah, well, I'll go back and do one better, I think. Back in 1975, when leaded gasoline was still being used in cars, you could look at a typical amount of lead in a man, and an adult, and that was about 165 milligrams. And that was found by basically cremating people after they died, of course, and finding out how much lead was left. 165 milligrams, and that's about the weight of a paperclip. A lead poisoned man had about 500 milligrams, 3 paper clips. And so the difference between a typical man and a lead poisoned man was threefold. Now, I've already said that today we're about 10 to 100 times more heavily exposed than our pre-industrial ancestors. And in 1975, they were about 1,000 times more heavily exposed. So lead levels have come down, but the difference between a lead poisoned man and a non-lead poisoned man is just so small relative to the amounts of exposure we have. So it doesn't really directly get at your question, but very small amounts of lead are toxic. And I don't think we've seen, I think we're going to find down below parts per billion that lead can be toxic to humans. We haven't seen the end of it, is what I'm expecting.
Thank you. So I think that is all of the questions that we've had submitted so far. So if folks feel you haven't had your question answered, or if you have a follow-up question, feel free to put it in the Q&A. So Hep, I want to turn it back to you. Is there anything on your mind that you want to?
I do have a number. I'm sorry, I just found this. So when the EPA did their study in 2008, Reid-Hillview put out more than 1,200 pounds of lead into the air annually, and it was at 25th in the country at that time among 3,400 airports.
Wow. And wow. So that is striking when you think about 3 paper clips weight is enough to poison a person.
Right. That's a lot of paper clips. Yeah. So thank you for that, Dr. Lanphear.
That's huge. And Supervisor Chavez, do you know how that estimate was arrived at? Is
I
that?
don't. This was in the EPA's report. So they have this report is from, I thought it was from 2011, but it was from 2008. And this was their 2008 report.
Okay, so we could maybe look at that report and try to get their methodology. Okay, that is a helpful lead. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So I want to turn it back to Hep. Is there anything on your mind that you would like to add to the discussion or ask Dr. Lanphear or Supervisor Chavez at this point? And we'll look to see if anything else comes up in the chat.
Yeah, just so Robert Boutel's study, he did a map of the annual lead load that was at the 3 airports. And I want to say Boulder was about 400 pounds. Garlic's getting chopped back there. So about 300, 500 pounds. RMMA, I think, was close to 1,200 pounds. And then Erie was about a little higher than Boulder. And so we're in Longmont, it was about 600 pounds. So we're here in Boulder, we're kind of in the middle of a little lead vortex. My particular house is a little bit north of the runway. And yeah, not only, I mean, the planes come over, it's over 100 decibels, but they're right over where I can smell it. And they're about maybe 300 to 500 feet up. And this is one of those cases where the FAA won't enforce its own altitude standard. But, so that was one of my arguments to city council. I'm like, well, if the FAA won't follow its own rules, why do you have to follow their rules? I know that's kind of simplistic, but just the belligerence of the people that I met with at the FAA and the aviation community, I just don't get a sense that they really think this is an evil or a bad thing, and they're going to try to put it off as long as possible. And that's why I was trying to see, other than doing it the old-fashioned way of organizing, I guess there is no other way. I thought maybe, Howard Zinn's old quote, "You don't follow laws that aren't just." And so I was hoping that maybe you can comment on maybe how you were able to get the rest of your crew supervisors to, go along. And it sounds like it was probably pressure from below that pushed them that way.
Yes. And Bruce, I saw your hand up. Did you? Our Dr. Organizer, I love it.
I wanted to bring up two things. Number one, I think you really had champions in the leadership in the county, and yet there was also a big public outcry. And I think you need both. And it's certainly clear that the science by itself is almost never enough. You need to have people get behind it. I did want to just point out, everybody's talking about all the amounts of lead that are released from these different airports, 10,000 pounds, 460 pounds. It goes somewhere. And we've been talking about human health today, but there are loons and there are eagles and dying from lead poisoning as well. And I don't know if anybody is familiar with Mary Oliver, but if I could, can I take 1 minute and read a Mary Oliver poem?
Please.
All right. The title is Lead. Here's a story to break your heart. Are you willing? This winter, the loons came to our harbor and died one by one of nothing we could see. A friend told me of one on the shore that lifted its head and opened the elegant beak and cried out in the long, sweet savoring of its life, which if you have heard it, you know is a sacred thing, and for which if you have not heard it, you had better hurry to where they still sing. And believe me, tell no one just where that is. The next morning, this loon, speckled and iridescent, and with a plan to fly home to some hidden lake, was dead on the shore. I tell you this to break your heart, by which I mean only that it break open and never close again to the rest of the world.
Thank you, Doctor. It is heartbreaking. And we appreciate the reminder that it's not just human health, but it is all of the critters that we share this planet with who are also impacted by what happens when we put lead into the environment. I do want to, I see another question that was submitted actually through email. This is something that has been a conversation here in Boulder, that if we were to close our airport, that potentially it won't matter because other planes will just zip into that airspace, right? That somehow the airport creates this protective zone over Boulder. And if we remove that by not having an airport, other planes will just fill in the gap and maybe be worse. Is that something that ever came up in the rhetoric or in the discussion around Reid-Hillview, something that you've considered?
No, actually.
Interesting that it never came up because it's been so prevalent here as a line of reasoning of why we should not close the airport.
I mean, yeah, I understand the argument, but it doesn't, and that, yeah, that doesn't really make, I mean, I understand it intellectually, but that's really not something that's come up at all.
Okay, well, maybe we should ask someone who has actually closed an airport and then they have some experience with whether that happened to them or not.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, we are coming towards the end of our webinar time here, and I think we have run out of questions that have been submitted. So I think I just want to open it up to you, Supervisor Chavez and Dr. Lanphear, for any last words. How do you want to end this and wrap it up? What wisdom do you have for us, or questions you want to leave us with?
Well, I wanted to say three things. One, I'm delighted to have an opportunity to share thoughts and ideas with all of you. Two, I'm so blown away that you are getting this put on the ballot. That is a lot of work, and that is exactly the kind of organizing that I would just really want to honor and lift up. I will close with just this thought, which is that in our county, there was a single member of the Board of Supervisors in the 1990s that tried to close the airport because she thought it was such an incompatible land use. And then another member came in the 2000s and she did the same thing. And she tried the same thing. And that was after years of battling and being worried about not just the toxins, but noise and the risk of planes crashing and into homes and that. And so two things. One, we really built on the leadership of those two people. And I'm mindful that these fights can be long. And I just, from my perspective, I took what they did so right and at a time when it was so difficult to do and really just kept their work going. And I feel like we're just passing the baton to each other. I will be out of office in December. And one of the things that I'm termed out. And one of the issues that I'm asking every single candidate that's running for the Board of Supervisors is what are they going to do on a number of issues, but on the top of my list is how are they going to handle Reid-Hillview? And I say that because the organizing, there is no way around it. If it had just been me, even if it had been the brilliant Dr. Zaran, I think Bruce hit it on the head, which is how do you do studies in all these places and there's not the kind of movement, especially when you look at, a state like Michigan that had the Flint, Michigan crisis, like that doesn't even compute. So organizing and really engaging people, there's no shortcut to building political space and will. And let me just say this for the elected officials. I don't know if there are any on here, but let me say to you all as an elected official that people ask us to do hard things all the time. And when you run for office, you know that one of the things that's going to happen is that you go from being a candidate where everybody thinks you have the possibility to be amazing to being just any other politician who's on the take and who's awful. And, you get the worst hate mail. And it's just, there's nobody brings you flowers and candy for doing a good job. And so what that means is that, there are a lot of people who worry about how many hills do you die on. And one of my theories of change is that when people do the right thing and it's hard, we have to have a base of people around them that support them. Or what happens is you just get beat down so much. And you know this from the struggle you're having with your airport. So what I would just say is when you get elected leaders who are excited and willing to pitch in, you cannot leave them on the battlefield alone and cheer from them from the outside. Because when you're doing something that's this hard, that you're dealing with multiple levels of government, with frankly an industry that has been really just terrible to the communities they're in and not worried about human health, you have a lot you're changing. And so support them and create spaces. And this is what I call it, creating the political space and will for everybody to do the right thing. And it takes a lot of work, but I think it's going to be really worth it. I won't be making decisions about what happens with the land, and I'm not going to be making decisions about what exact day it closes, but but I did my baton part. Like I've got the baton and it's ready to go into somebody really good there, you know, somebody who's going to do a good job and see it over the finish line. But that is organizing. There is just no shortcut.
Thank you so much. And so I want to just acknowledge, as one of the organizers of the Airport Neighborhood Campaign here in Boulder, that the work that we are doing, absolutely, it does exactly what you just said, Supervisor Chavez. It builds on the work of people who came before us. I first heard about the idea of closing the airport from a former councilwoman named Lisa Morzell, who also got termed out. And Lisa is actually one of our 5 people who, as a resident of Boulder, put their name on every page of every petition that we circulated to get this on the ballot. You have to have 5 residents who put their name on it. So Lisa is still with us, but not having to do all the heavy lifting right now. Another council person who has really taken up this baton is Mark Wallach, who is on the call tonight. And Mark, I took the liberty of going ahead and promoting you to a panelist on the off chance that you might want to say something. I don't know, Mark, you're usually so very shy about public speaking, but I did want to give you an opportunity to chime in here if you would like to. And then we'll go to Bruce Lanphear to wrap things up from a scientific perspective. But Mark, did you want to respond to the supervisor's comments or to what you've heard tonight?
When was the last time I did not want to say something? I really appreciate everybody's participation this evening, and you know, the path that you have outlined for us. Laura is correct. This is almost a generational effort. It probably started around Lisa's time. I picked it up 4 or 5 years ago. There was very little support for it. I think there's almost a majority, possibly there is a majority on council now to move forward in this direction. And all that we need is for the residents of Boulder to approve decommissioning the airport for us to go forward and take that path. So yeah, I agree with everything that Supervisor Chavez has said. It requires organizing, it requires effort, it requires doing all of this over a great period of time. And, you know, this is the first year that I've had some degree of optimism that we might actually hit the goal. And I will be off council, as she will be off council, but well before the first home is ever built on this reclaimed land. But I have some optimism that we can ultimately get there. And again, Laura, as always, thank you for your efforts, and thank you for putting together this webinar, which has been very helpful to me as a member of the Boulder City Council. So thank you all, and good night.
Thank you, Mark. And I do have to acknowledge, I had nothing to do with putting this webinar together. It was all HEP. So HEP Ingham, thank you so much for your organizing efforts and connecting us with Supervisor Chavez and Dr. Lanphear and making this webinar happen, while the rest of us were very much distracted with gathering signatures. Dr. Lanphear, did you have any final comments or thoughts for us to leave us with?
I think just to reiterate what Cindy said and Mark said as well, I used to think that once the science was there, my job was done. Somebody else would pick it up and run with it. And what I've learned over the past 30 years is that's rarely the case. The science is maybe the beginning, maybe it comes from a different part of our community, but by itself, the science is never enough. It really is about the collaboration and the community getting together and saying, this is what we want for our community. And so it's heartening to see this, because too often or for too long, so much of my work was neglected. That's beginning to change. And certainly what you're doing here is a part of that change. So it's just so gratifying to see.
Well, thank you so much, Laura, for co-hosting, and Matt Wilson and Supervisor Chavez and Professor Lanphear. I really appreciate it. I'm so glad you guys showed up, and we've got this excellent recording for tonight. That's, you know, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good night,
Hep.
everybody. Thank you.
Thank
luck.
you. And
Thank
thank
you.
you for everybody who attended tonight and for the great questions. And
Yeah,
good
questions
night,
asked,
everybody.